Starting to see some attendees rolling in here. Good evening, everybody. Welcome. All right, starting to see some people join. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the MBTA Communities Act Public Information Session. We're just going to give it a couple minutes here while we allow the people to access the meeting and get situated. So just bear with us. We'll get started in a few minutes here. Good evening, everybody who just showed up. If you missed my first announcement, we're just going to give it a couple minutes here to allow more people to join, but we will get started momentarily. Thanks for coming. All right, maybe another minute here before we get going. All right, if anybody on the panel would like to get started, I think still seeing some folks coming in, but it's time to get going.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Good evening. I'm Carol Lisbon, Planning Board Chair, and on behalf of the MBTA Communities Act team, thank you all for joining us tonight. It's wonderful to see so many participating. This is the first of several information sessions that we'll be holding. The dialogue is very important because while we'll be providing information to you, it's your thoughts and questions that will provide the team with invaluable and much appreciated input. Your feedback is essential, as this is a community issue that Delaware is obligated to address by 12/31 of this year through adoption of a bylaw at a special town meeting that we've currently scheduled for September 29th. It's my honor to introduce a team that has been working on this for well over 3 years to get us to this point. Jody Hsu is Vice Chair of the Planning Board and the MBTA project leader. Jeff Davis of Horton Witten is a consulting group with extensive MBTA Communities Act experience. Town planner Jasmine Farinacci has been working with state agencies supporting the act. And Chris Costello, Dover's Assistant Town Administrator, will be managing the webinar tonight and has been invaluable in developing and implementing our communications plan. Tonight, Jody and Jeff will provide a review of the MBTA Communities Act, how the team has gotten to this point, the preliminary results of the townwide survey that was launched a few weeks ago. We will ask 4 very specific questions for your live input, and then we'll go to a question and answer session where we hope you'll share your thoughts and provide the team with guidance as we move forward. So with that, let's get started, and I'm going to turn this over to Jody.
Thank you, Carol. And thank you for joining. As Carol said, I'm Jody Hsu. I'm Vice Chair of the Planning Board. I live at 10 Main Street, and I have been living and breathing the MBTA Communities Act for a lot of months. And I'm really looking forward to sharing what we've been learning and to hearing from you what you want to understand better or thoughts you have about how we can go about this process. So to begin, I just want to get everybody level set about this law and its impact for Dover and why we're here tonight. As many of you know, probably, the MBTA Communities Act was signed into law by Charlie Baker's administration in 2021. And the intent of the law was to create more housing near transit. The law requires every one of the 177 communities that are abutting or adjacent to MBTA service update their zoning to legalize the construction of some multifamily housing. And we'll get into some more details in a few slides. Notably, communities that fail to comply will become ineligible for certain state funding programs. And I'm going to ask Jasmine to put into the chat a little bit more detail about some of those funding programs, including the Housing Choice Initiative, the Local Capital Projects Fund, MassWorks, Housing Works, and others. There's a lot at stake, and I'll take you through just how much is at stake in a few slides. But it's really important to remind listeners that the planning board is by statute responsible for taking this process to town meeting. It's something that came from the state to Dover, and it's something that we're taking very seriously as a legal obligation to bring to town meeting 2 items. 1, a zoning bylaw to allow for by right multifamily housing, and second, a suggested overlay district area. And then it's up to the voters of Dover to decide if this is something that they want to pass. So we'll talk more about that as we move forward. So next slide, please, Jeff. I mentioned that there's a lot at stake. And so maybe the first place to look at is looking back. If we took a look at the grants that Dover's received over the course of the last few years, you start to get a sense for just how much money is at stake. In 2024, across the board, you can see a variety of funding that came into our town, totaling upwards of $800,000. Next slide. In 2023, that number was a bit bigger, $990,000. And in 2022, on the next slide, we're looking at over $2.3 million that was directed to Dover. And were awarded for a variety of different projects, including the design of the Center Street Bridge, as you see here, a feasibility study for culvert replacement, a water sustainability study. The list goes on, and we've been doing a lot of work trying to get a grasp on exactly what that is. But really, actually, when we look forward, it gets a little scarier. If you could give me the next slide. We're trying to get a good, strong handle on this number, but at the moment, our estimate is upwards of $13 million of at-risk funding that is potentially tied to compliance here. It includes an online permitting software initiative that the townhouse has begun and is moving strongly forward. That's to the tune of about $200,000. And then the Center Street Bridge construction, which could be upwards of $12 million. We anticipate that this will grow, but it's a dollar amount that we're taking very, very seriously and informs the town-wide work that we've been doing to pull together a really smart, thoughtful response to this requirement and to bring it in front of all of you for your input and ultimately your vote. Next slide. If you've been reading the Boston Globe, as so many of us do, you've probably been hearing a lot about the MBTA Communities Act. As you may know, the larger towns that have a compliance requirement have had an accelerated timeline to compliance. So many times towns like Milton, Newton, Needham, some of our neighbors have been tasked with complying before us. And there's been a lot in the news. Voters in Milton, as you may have heard, rejected the MBTA zoning work that was brought to their town meeting. And then the Attorney General filed a lawsuit against that town. So there's been a lot of speculation as to, what might happen with towns that are non-compliant. And on January 8th of this year, a lot of the questions here were put to bed when the Mass Supreme Judicial Court issued its landmark ruling on this case, the Milton versus the Attorney General case. And essentially, the ruling reinforced that all MBTA communities are required to comply with the law and that the Attorney General does have the authority to enforce it. So we're continuing forward and we're seeing our job as continuing to march forward. There's always a lot of speculation about different things in the news and communities that are trying to figure out how or if they might comply, but we see our responsibility to get us to town meeting and to bring something in front of our voters and then respond accordingly depending upon that vote. Next slide, please. So why is the state doing this? As I said at the upfront, the ultimate goal is to encourage more housing to be built across the Commonwealth and to do so in a way that removes barriers to multifamily residential near transit. These are sort of the top three, as you can see here, streamlining the approvals process. A lot of that has to do with special permits and various local zoning that can make building multifamily housing harder than the state would like to see it would be. It often, as you can see here, requires a special permit, rezoning of land, or 40B developments. We do have a multifamily bylaw on the books, which we've had since 1990. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that and why it is not enough to get us to compliance, because some of you may have that question. We do have a multifamily housing bylaw. Next slide, please. So here's a snapshot. The 177 cities and towns that are required to comply fall into basically four buckets: rapid transit, commuter rail communities, adjacent communities, and those like Dover. We're an adjacent small town. And the definition of an adjacent small town is a community of 7,000 people or less, or a population density of less than 500 persons per square mile. And of course, Needham having an MBTA stop is the kicker here as to why we're considered an adjacent town. Next slide. Regardless of what bucket you fall into as a community of those four, all MBTA communities are required to meet the following. And you can see here that the list is fairly broad. You have to have at least one zoning district in which multifamily housing is permitted by right, which is defined as not needing a variance. It can include site plan review, but it can't be something that requires a special permit or a variance from the Zoning Board of Appeals. The minimum gross density of your MBTA district has to be 15 units per acre. I'll explain that a little bit more also. The location in some communities is that it can't be more than 0.5 miles from transit station, but for small adjacent towns, that is not a requirement. So we don't have to worry about location vis-a-vis the Needham station. There can be no age restrictions on the multifamily housing that is allowed by right. So it has to be suitable for families with children, and it can't have bedroom or occupancy caps. Importantly, the bylaw has to allow for parity with other uses. And what that means essentially is that the multifamily housing that is allowed by right cannot be required to meet higher standards than other permitted uses in town. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Compliance deadlines, as you know, vary. Ours is December 31st of this year, 2025. Next slide, please. So many of you might even wonder what exactly is multifamily housing. Here's the state's definition. It's a building with 3 or more residential dwelling units or 2 or more buildings on the same lot with more than one residential dwelling unit in each building. That's the state's definition for this multifamily housing initiative. These are the types of homes that are often thought to be a good fit for people at different stages of their life, whether elderly residents looking to downsize, empty nesters, young adults, single parents, lots of different ideas of how multifamily housing can be appropriate in towns. Next slide. But a picture is sort of worth 1,000 words. You've probably seen this in other communities. These are just very general ideas of what multifamily housing can look like. Often you hear it referred to as a shared wall. We have the ability, as you'll see, to put in dimensional requirements to address things like massing and setbacks, but we cannot mandate certain design. So just as we can't mandate a single family home design in town, we can't mandate the design of multifamily housing, but there's a lot we can do to ensure its appropriateness for Dover, and we're going to get into that. Next slide, please. So in a nutshell, what do we really actually need to do in the next bunch of months, about 7 months between now and our planned special town meeting on September 29th that Carol referenced? We have 3 things we have to do. First, we have to select a district or districts, because it can be more than one district, to be zoned for MBTA compliance. And we're going to talk a lot about that tonight because many of you may have filled out our survey. The focus of tonight's meeting is to give you an introduction to this compliance process, but really to hone in on location. So that's our first task. Then we have to write a zoning bylaw that regulates multifamily housing in this proposed district. And at the planning board level, we've got a draft of our current working version of the bylaw up on our MBTA webpage. That's a work in progress, and we're really looking for feedback to it. The survey that many of you filled out was focused on location, but next we're going to be asking for lots of input on the bylaw as well. It gets written at the planning board, and then ultimately we'll bring that to town meeting for all of you to vote on, which is step 3. Vote at town meeting to approve this bylaw and the zoning map amendment that will accompany it before December 31st. Next slide, please. So here's the compliance requirements that we have to meet. So these get baked in to our bylaw that we'll be drafting, or we're in the process of drafting for small adjacent towns. First, the minimum multifamily housing unit capacity is 102 units. So we have to create an overlay district and accompanying dimensional standards where multifamily housing can be built by right, and it has to be able to, all of them don't have to be built, but it has to allow for or accommodate a minimum of 102 units. And that's driven off of Dover's 2020 housing stock numbers, and we have to meet a 5% target. The minimum land area of the district is not mandated for Dover, but we do know that if the area is less than 5 acres, they all have to be contiguous. So we can't sort of chop it up into various small pieces around town. We'll talk about why the planning board, in consultation with the housing task force, has determined that the best path forward is to pick one district for simplicity's sake. The minimum gross density in the zoned area is 15 units per acre, and we'll see how that plays out in some of the following slides. No location requirements, so we don't have to be within a half a mile of the MBTA station. And again, our compliance deadline is December 31st. Next slide. So one of the terms that I referenced was unit capacity, and I think this is a really important term to stop and drill down on just a little bit so everybody understands it. Unit capacity is essentially, if you take a parcel of land, even if there's already development on that parcel of land, you measure it as if it was undeveloped. The compliance model that Jeff's going to walk us through factors in things like wetlands and setbacks. But we imagine a parcel as if it was undeveloped, and then we work backwards to unit capacity. So Jeff can take us through that a little bit more carefully, but it's an important term to keep in mind. Next slide, please. This is really important, what Section 3A does not require of us. Most importantly, it does not require that multifamily housing, in fact, be built. Compliance, according to the state, is determined by the development and the approval of zoning that meets the standards, but has nothing to do with whether or not the housing actually gets built. So that's number one. The second really important thing here is that it does not compel communities like Dover to design or pay for any new infrastructure to accommodate future multifamily development in the district that we develop. So we don't have to worry about the fact that we don't have water or other infrastructure needs that exist in the location that we pick. That does not become Dover's responsibility. And really importantly, the law does not supersede or override Dover's wetlands or Title V laws. So to put a fine point on this, it does not mean that a developer can come in and override Dover's septic and water requirements. And that's really notably different from a 40B development that comes into town. I also just want to mention, though it's not on this slide, that the law does not require that affordable housing be incorporated as a component from a development perspective. And also in conjunction with the Housing Task Force and the Board of Selectmen, we've determined that we won't be requiring affordable housing. We have the option because the state allows communities that option, but we've determined that the best path forward is to not include an affordable housing requirement. Next slide. So what have we been up to? A lot is the answer. It's been really busy and it goes back a couple of years. But in 2023, very notably, we contracted with the Horsley Witten Group. Jeff is here with us tonight through a technical assistance grant to all MBTA communities to help us with this process, because we also know that there's a cost associated with this compliance, working through all of these issues. So we were with the recipients, along with all the other MBTA communities, of a grant that allowed us to hire Jeff to work with us on this process. The first thing we did was start to think about identifying potential MBTA overlay zones. And that was our starting point for discussion, like where could this go? And we also worked with Horsley Witten and our town council to develop a first draft of the MBTA Communities Act bylaw that, as I said, you can review as in its current state up on our town MBTA page. We also included a timeline on that page of all of the other work that we've been undertaking, like meetings, legal counsel, working with Jeff, planning board time. So there's been a lot going on, and we encourage you to take a look at it. Many months of work to date on this project. Next slide, please. And so, as I said, the first thing was like, how do we even conceive of where this could go? Like, how would we think about this? And working with Jeff, we came up with a four-part framework for our work, very specifically tied to the locating of a proposed or identified district area. The first thing we would do was determine district boundaries, like where should we put it? And as we know, there's no minimum size required for Dover, but if we come up with small locations, less than 5 acres, it would all have to be contiguous. So we pretty quickly zeroed in on the idea that we would prefer one location that would allow for the capacity and the volume of units that would need to be possible in that district. And that was sort of one way we started to narrow down our thinking. Step 2 is to think about dimensional requirements. How tall should the buildings be in the district? How tall would we want them to be? Because we're Dover. What makes sense in Dover? What about setbacks? What about density? How can we play around with those factors in the context of a district and get to our compliance requirement, but not much more? And also, where would it make sense? Then we would, step 3, go in and look at all of the zoning policy for the district, how it complies with the law, and make sure that we're carefully complying. We're in that process we're not there yet because we haven't even identified the district finally as a town. And then step 4 would be to enter all of this data into a compliance model, which Jeff will tell us about, and test different iterations. And that's what we're going to walk you through tonight, so that we can together find a scenario that meets the town's needs as well as the state law, because that's ultimately the sweet spot of where we want to get. Next slide, please. So step 1, how did we think about identifying possible locations? Well, we decided as a planning board team to think about some criteria. that would make sense for us to imagine where this could go. Really notable, we can't put it on town land. So if you're thinking town land or conservation land, we can't put it there. So we couldn't start with those properties. So we said, okay, let's look at pre-existing developments, because as we discussed on the slide where I referenced unit capacity, it doesn't have to go on empty land. You know, we could overlay it on an existing development, and if we can figure out how to make the dimensional requirements and everything work, that might be something we want to consider as a town. Philosophically, there's pros and cons, but it's worth considering. Then we identify a single area, as I mentioned, rather than a lot of small little parcels. We also thought, let's look at undeveloped property where density would be less likely to disturb a residential neighborhood. Again, another philosophical approach, but let's look at it. We thought, let's make sure we think about proximity to town services as one of our criteria. Let's consider some infrastructure requirements, but not know that we don't have a responsibility to them. And then let's notably really consider state compliance very carefully, because we don't want to go through all this work and then realize, oh, we can't even put it there because we can't make the math work, the modeling work. Next slide, please. So right off the bat, we came up with some initial considerations, and we asked Horsley Witten to look at 4 existing sites where development already existed. That is County Court in blue and the pastures over on 109. Next slide. And we also asked them to look at Dover Farms in pink and the Meadows in green near the town center, just because those were areas where we had existing development. Next slide. Subsequently, we were also asked to look at the property on Junction Street that in the summer and fall of 2024, the town was notified that a developer was looking at the potential for putting in some development over on that property. And so we were asked to add this to our consideration set. And that made a lot of sense too, because it also met our criteria for being near some town services, and most notably the Dover Sherburne School Complex. And also is undeveloped. So we added that to the consideration set that Jeff and his team modeled. Next slide, please. Step 2 of our framework was to then think about some proposed dimensional requirements. And we started off realizing that, in fact, Dover already has a multifamily residence bylaw and pathway in our town code. It was adopted in 1990. So if you're new to town, or somebody like me who's not that new, but this precedes me, I had a little research to do. But we decided to ask our consultant, Jeff, to model the bylaw and the dimensional requirements that we would consider after these already approved dimensional requirements in town. That made sense because remember, also at the beginning of this presentation, I told you that we have to work with parity to other zoning bylaw information that we already have on our town code. So we thought, okay, this is a great place to start. So here you can see the dimensional requirements that we're currently using for the bylaw itself. And we're using these to layer on top of these proposed locations and say, does it work? So minimum lot size would be 20,000 square feet. Street frontage, as you can see, 100 feet. Maximum building height, 2.5 stories, 35 feet. Lot coverage at 25%. Open space requirement, 40%. Setbacks, front, side, and rear, as you can see on the slide. And we thought, okay, these have already been approved. We're not starting from scratch or trying to put something brand new into our code. Maybe that will make this a little bit more palatable, and we'll see where we get with that information. Next slide, please. Then we asked, we want to look at our information, and Horsley Witten Town Council are looking hard and deeply at other draft zoning amendment policies, making sure they comply with the law, which brings us to step 4 on the next slide, where we run the compliance model. And I'm going to hand it off to Jeff because he's our expert, but essentially the state released a compliance model in August of 2022, and all communities use this. It provides step-by-step instructions, and Jeff and his team take the locations that we've identified, the dimensional requirements we've started with, and they input all of that data into the model in order to learn, like, what do we learn about these first 5 locations that we identified. So I'm going to hand it off to Jeff because he's the expert and can tell us how that all shook out. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you so much, Jody. And I will say, for anyone who's listening, your town staff and volunteers have really become experts on this topic over the last couple of years, and I've been really impressed working with them. As Jody mentioned, we put these 5 properties through the compliance model with those dimensional standards from your existing multifamily zoning to see what would happen, like which of these by themselves could meet the state's requirements that are laid out for Dover. So of the 5, 3 comply on their own. So that includes County Court, Junction Street, and the Meadows. So what that means is, of course, we've already discussed, there's no minimum area required, but we're just showing you here the acreage for each of these sites, although that can be whatever you want. That model unit capacity, minimum of 102 units, all but the pastures and Dover Farms meet that requirement. All, in fact, other than Dover Farms, meet the density requirement, that 15 units per acre or greater. So really, we found that we have 3 options that, with the draft zoning that the town has been working on, should meet the state's requirements. So the next question then becomes, well, what does the town prefer? Because that is really our goal here, is to find you multiple options that meet the state's requirements and also are the most palatable for the community, and hopefully will get you some good things as well, and not just be an obligation, right? So as part of that, we opened a survey about 2.5 weeks ago. The numbers I'm going to show you tonight were collected from March 4th to March 18th. That survey is still open. We are still collecting responses, and in fact, we paused for this report at 132 responses. As of today, we're up to 149 responses. We'll keep that open at least until next week. We have a second one of these public information sessions next Wednesday, I believe. So that survey will stay open until at least then, and then we will present to the public the full set of responses. So this, again, is just a snapshot of where we were after the first 2 weeks of the survey being open. So the survey went property by property. We took the 3 properties that would meet the state's requirements, dropped the 2 that would not, and asked folks what you thought about that area for MBTA community. So the specific question we asked was, please share your input about locating an MBTA community zoning district at, in this case, the Meadows. So full responses, 132 responses. Of those, about 40% fully support or somewhat support the MBTA overlay at this location. However, a majority, over 51%, did not support this location. Surprisingly, there were only about 8% of respondents said they needed more information before they could decide. It's actually really low. So a lot of people came into this survey with a strong sense of their preference, which is good. So in terms of some of the comments, people are allowed to leave comments explaining their preference. People were concerned about the distance from public transit, that there isn't really any transit right here at this location. Concern about further straining the public education system, concerns about traffic and potential impacts on water resources. So I think hopefully a lot of the information that Jody provided earlier on in this presentation, certainly, yes, we've discussed the lack of public transit, the potential impacts on water resources. Again, we just really want to reiterate to everyone that the state can't force Dover to approve a development that would overtax your existing utilities. So whatever your existing water standards are, those will have to be adhered to, even if it means that fewer than that 102 units ultimately gets built. So right now, that's really what matters. So second, we looked at county court, again, located along County Street. And this is another one that did meet the requirements. This was actually the most popular of the three. So about just under 65% of respondents fully support or somewhat support. Just under 30% did not support. Even fewer people, just under 7%, need more information before they could decide. In terms of the comments that we received on this property, that was a good location for density, relatively close to transit. There were some concerns that additional septic system capacity may cause problems for neighbors, and a concern about potential rise in traffic on Route 109. But generally, there was more positive feeling about this location than the other two. And third, the Junction Street property near the high school. This one was actually the least popular, or at least had more people, a higher percentage of people who do not support this location at 53%, just about under 39% fully support or somewhat support. And again, less than 10% need additional information. Again, number one concern was that lack of access to public transit, potential loss of natural habitat, since this is an area that is currently undeveloped, and concerns about increasing traffic, including near the school. So we realized that there might be a lot of people who are taking this survey who weren't really keen on locating anything anywhere. So we wanted to see if you had to choose, which would be your preference, even if you think they're all bad, right? What's the lesser of three evils? And again, that really reiterated what we learned from the other questions, that county court is by far preferred. It was listed as the number one choice for just under half of respondents, and about 29% listed as number two. So certainly that does seem to be, again, not that everyone is pleased with this site, but it does seem to be the most acceptable of the three. Another question we asked was whether you are a person who owns property in Dover and you think it might be an appropriate location for MBTA community zoning. So we didn't want people, recommending their neighbor's property, but if you own property that you thought would be appropriate, we wanted to know. So everyone responded to this, and literally everyone said no. So to date, we have not unearthed any additional potential sites. Finally, we had an open-ended question. We have an open-ended question that allows people to provide any other thoughts or comments related to any of the locations or the standards, the proposed standards for the MBTA Communities District. Most people skipped this question, but we did have about 50 people who responded. So just a summary of some of the most common comments. There are a number of people who were questioning whether the town should comply with the MBTA Communities Act at all. And, as Jody mentioned, and I think this is really worth reiterating, our time today, our time next week is really to figure out what we're bringing to town meeting that would be the most acceptable for the town. And really then it becomes a debate at town meeting about whether to adopt that. So I hope that, over the coming weeks, we can really focus on how do we come to a solution that is the most acceptable to the town. There were also concerns about limited public transit and an increase in traffic generally, potential effects on the school system, concerns that lower income residents might need more services but contribute less to the tax base. And I again want to reiterate what Jody said earlier. that the town currently is not proposing any required affordable housing at this site. This would all be market rate housing for people at different stages of their lives. Next, the need for water and sewer infrastructure. And again, we want to reiterate that whatever infrastructure exists today, you would base your approval of any development on the capacity of that infrastructure. You know, we're not required to overtax what you have today. And there were a minority, but there were a number of respondents who reiterated the need for equitable housing and were very supportive of this effort. So with that, I'm going to collaborate with Chris over the next several slides. So hopefully a number of you who are here tonight have already responded to the online survey, and that's great. Even if you have, we encourage you to respond to these pop-up polls. It's largely the same questions that we have online. We're not going to combine them with the feedback we're receiving from the online survey, but we will be reporting on these separately. So this is really just to get a snapshot, a pulse, the people who are, as it were, in the room this evening. So Chris, do you want to explain how that's going to work for us?
Absolutely. So everyone, in a moment here, you're going to see a small box pop up on your screen, and we'll have some options that you're seeing right on this slide that you're currently viewing. So the poll will be for this proposed location, and the options are all here on the screen as well. So I'm going to launch this poll, and we'll ask everybody to, answer and respond. We'll give extra time for the first one, just so everybody can get comfortable with the concept. So we'll launch this. So hopefully you're seeing that on your screen now. I'm seeing some responses come in. We have about 63 people with us right now. So we'll try to let everybody get comfortable here. I've seen about 80% responded so far, so we'll give it another 30 seconds. Right, another 10 seconds here. Nice job, everybody. Still seeing some trickle in. All right. So we'll end the poll. You should be seeing the results here. Looks like we have a pretty even spread across the responses.
Yeah, that's interesting. So more favorable than what we've seen in the online survey so far, but a plurality of respondents not supporting, and about 56% in total somewhat support or fully support. All right, thank you. Let's move on to our next location, which is County Court. So let us know how you feel about that location, County Court on County Street.
All right, we're going to fire up the poll here. Go ahead and feel free to respond. All right, everyone's getting the hang of it. Responses are coming in pretty fast now. All right, another 10 seconds here. It's that 90% response rate. So good job, everybody. Okay. Take a look at the results here.
Great, thank you, Chris. So again, pretty similar to what we saw in the online survey. I'd say more people, a higher percentage of people fully supporting, but about the same percentage overall that fully support or somewhat support, and about the same amount that do not support. But again, this seems like a stronger option for the town. So moving on to location number 3, Junction Street.
All right, Junction Street poll. Go, we'll give this one a full minute here. All right, another 10 seconds, but 91% responses. Thank you all for participating. Okay. Take a look at the results.
All right. So again, slightly more favorable than the online survey, but again, generally do not support. 46% do not support. So yeah, basically we're following what very similar to what we've been seeing on the online survey. Again, slightly more favorable for Junction Street and the Meadows, and definitely County Court being the preferred. So like we did online, we're going to now finally ask that you rank the 3 potential locations. So again, 1 being the location you think is most appropriate, and 3 being the location you think is least appropriate.
Right, so you're seeing a little different setup here. A grid, you'll see your options on the top row and the locations on the side row. So please click one of the top row options for each location. Give a little extra time here since this one's a little different. Do another 30 seconds here. Okay, it looks like the responses have stopped, so we'll go ahead and share the results.
All right, so the feedback is clear. County Court is the preferred alternative for a majority of respondents, and the least favored by a fairly significant margin is Junction Street. So thank you for that tonight. And again, we will be reporting back on what we heard tonight. We will not be combining this with what we've been getting on the SurveyMonkey poll online, but we'll report back on both of these polls. And again, encourage you, if you haven't taken that online poll, please do. Please encourage your friends and neighbors too as well. All right. So I apologize, Jody. Am I going over the next steps, or are you?
I'm happy to do it. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Jeff. So as I said at the beginning, we're hoping to be able to pass a zoning bylaw update by December 31st, 2025, or risk losing this grant funding or facing legal action. So over the next several months, the planning board, the town of Dover, Horsley Witten Group will be conducting a few more information sessions like this to address your ideas, your feedback. At some point, that bylaw gets written and we need to make a selection as a town. In the coming weeks, we'll have an information session on, this says April 3rd, but it's actually April 22nd, a public information session. And then the survey is still open. Mark your calendars for September 29th for a planned special town meeting. We have lots of opportunities to collect your feedback beyond these information sessions, including reaching out directly to our town planner, Jasmine Farinacci, whether by phone or email. We really, really want to hear from you because we're really looking to bring to town meeting a proposed location and accompanying bylaw that feels like the best possible outcome for Dover. And when we get to town meeting, it's really important that everybody knows the law says that we need a simple majority, so 50% plus one vote to approve this change to our zoning bylaw. So we really appreciate you being here and are looking forward to questions that you may have for us this evening.
Okay, everybody, so we're going to open this up to some Q&A. We're going to ask those in attendance if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment of the panel, please go ahead and use the raise hand feature on the bottom of your screen. We'll acknowledge those who we're going to move in to accept your questions or thoughts. So feel free, raise your hand, and we will start pulling people in. And also, when you do join, if you could just state your full name, that'd be great. All right, so I'm seeing Dick Malcolm.
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you, Jody and Carol and your teams for all the work you've done and this presentation. My question is if you're not considering an overlay district and you're looking at raw land, how do you know that that land that you're proposing to be designated would be suitable for multifamily housing, i.e. would it support the housing with in light of wetlands, septic, and water? And I mention this really more in relation to Junction Street, because I know that land is, majority of that land is wet. And I also know when the developer was looking at this land in 2023, the fall of 2023, I believe, you know, they did a whole wetland study, which the town has received. And they also went to town of Medfield to ask for a water connection and sewer connection, which was turned down by the town of Medfield. So I'm wondering with this Junction Street parcel, you know, whether it can even support multifamily housing.
Thank you. Carol, you want me to take a stab at that one?
Sure.
Okay, thanks, Dick. That's a really good question. I just want to mention first off, when we talk about any of these proposed locations, we are specifically talking about an overlay district. So essentially what that means is that the overlay district exists, but the underlying zoning also continues to exist. So for example, Junction Street, that's I believe that's, which one is it, Jasmine? Is it R2? I can't remember which district specifically it's in. But if the owner of the property wants to continue to keep it undeveloped, that's an option. If they want to sell it to a buyer who wants to build a single family house, that's an option. It just gives that extra additional option for a developer who might be interested and who purchases the property to take advantage of this different zoning. So that's sort of the first step. The second is a really good question. And as I mentioned, the law does not require that the infrastructure exists to support the development at this time. But we do take into account wetlands, for example, and Jeff's model, and Jeff, you might want to mention this, the compliance model does factor in wetlands. It does not factor in availability of water, and you're right, because we know that Medfield is not interested in supplying water to that location. So that's a conundrum. You know, it again gets back to this idea that what we're required to do is identify a location and write a bylaw that gets passed at town meeting. We're not required to be responsible for those infrastructure requirements that would be important and meaningful for development someday. Jeff, do you want to talk a little bit more about how you factor in wetlands and other
Yeah,
considerations?
That's absolutely right. So the state has a number of, they've mapped out the entire MBTA communities area, and they have excluded land. So when we did the analysis on Junction Street, there is a significant portion of that area that is wet and that has been subtracted from consideration altogether. And even with that subtraction, you do end up technically complying with the state's requirements. And then, as Jody stated, the model does not take into consideration access to utilities. So if a developer came in, made a proposal, it might be a much lower scale, less dense development that could be approved today with your existing infrastructure, and that would be okay. That would still meet the requirements of the law.
Other questions?
All right, before we get to the next question, just want to remind everybody, use the raise hand feature if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment. We're here to provide information and accept any feedback. So I just wanted to encourage people to participate if you are so inclined. Recognizing John Jeffries. John, you with us?
Jody, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yep.
I asked this question in the chat. I don't know if you're following the chat or
I
if
did.
anyone's
Thanks, John.
monitoring the chat. So was the original legislation written to be tied to state aid and state grants? And if it was not, when did that happen specifically?
I see that
I can-
Carol has responded. The MassWorks and Housing Choice Community Grants were first identified by the state, and then other grant programs have been added. I don't know, John, the exact date, but I will say I think that something I would share with this group. I was at a town hall for our Congressman, Jake Auchincloss, sometime before the holidays. And I heard him say at that town hall, because at the time, Needham was sort of going through a lot of gyrations about this in their own community. And he said at the town hall that his office would not support communities who were applying for federal grants if they were not in compliance with the MBTA Communities Act. So I do feel like it's growing, you know, the compliance downside, or the
That's not
downside associated with lack of compliance.
I'm sorry, that's just not consistent with the original legislation, though. I'm not denying what you're saying, Jody, is true.
Yeah.
That may be, in fact, the case, but it's just not consistent with the original intent of this law. And so what I'm trying to get a handle on, and I think it's critically important to the residents of Dover, is this compliance issue part tying to state aid. That seems to be in Jake's situation political and politically motivated. So it just does not seem consistent with the original intent of the legislation.
Thank you.
Do you agree or do you disagree?
You know, I'm really trying to stay focused on the role of the planning board, which is to get us to the point where we can vote on compliance. So, you know, kind of my personal opinion on it, I'm trying to keep out of it. I'm really focused on the fact that it's been a really complicated thing for towns all over the Commonwealth. And as a member of the planning board, and particularly as the person tasked with trying to lead this to town meeting, the focus for me is how do we get to town meeting? And then that becomes a vote for the citizens of Dover to decide.
I appreciate it. Thank you for it. I think that everything that we have done since this has been brought to us has been difficult. I think that there has not been a lot of consistency, and I think that that is going to be a big problem for the residents and voters of Dover. So I do think that there needs to be consistency, and I do think there needs to be clarity in some of these issues because they do seem to be, in your words, growing. Thank you.
Thanks.
This is Carol Lisbon. As a follow-up to the conversation with John. I'd like to respond to a question that is in the Q&A section here from Christopher Verney. The question is, has Dover considered challenging this law in court like Grantham is doing in light of the fact that there is no MBTA service in Dover? If no, why not? Dover clearly, excuse me, Dover clearly has exceptional infrastructure constraints, which we all appreciate. So, as we've talked about before, this has been going on since late 2021. And there have been various steps that the state has required towns to go through to finally get to a bylaw. And the decision was made very early on with the consultation between the planning board and the Board of Selectmen that we would continue to do what we needed to do to become compliant with this law. And if there were changes in the law or decisions by the state courts on this, that we would then adapt accordingly. But because of the huge financial risks of not meeting the December 31st, 2025 deadline for a bylaw, the decision was made to continue. So that's what we've been doing. To date, I think it's safe to say that no town has yet won in court, and it has been the recommendation of our town council that we continue this way until something comes up legally at the state level that indicates a change in our process. Thank you.
Okay, looks like we have a hand raised for, it looks like we don't have a name here, so just label as iPad, but if you could just state your name when we're allowed to talk. So go ahead and ask your question.
Hi there, my name is Joyce. We have a place at County Court. It's frustrating what's going. So right now, Red Robin's they're trying to build a very large place on County Court and use Tisdale Drive. Does that affect any of this? I think a lot of people who live in County Court feel like we're tucked away in the corner, and that this isn't the first time people find that property to be the one to build on. So I'm sort of taking it, from a personal perspective, but also there are problems that the new developers running into with water, building septic, there's wetlands. So I know that, I forgot the woman's name, but she did say that those aren't to be considered, but to a degree, I guess they should be also.
Carol, you want to address that one?
So
I guess the comment.
yeah. So all those activities on Tisdale Drive are independent. And the Tisdale 40B application is going through the Zoning Board of Appeals at this point. And we'll go through that process. And I believe the County Court HOA is actively involved in that process as well. I think it's important to remember, and it's something that this team constantly has to remind itself of, which is that this project and this law is not a call to action to build. It is a call to action to zone. So if there are infrastructure issues and so forth, unlike a 40B where there might be ways to get around that, that's not the case, as Jody discussed before. That's not the case with a MBTA Communities Act development. So a developer would have to come in, look at the overlay district and take a look and develop a business plan that makes sense to do. So it's important to remember that even though we tend to think about zoning as okay, and then it's going to happen, that's not the case necessarily here. And quite frankly, relatively unlikely given Dover's infrastructure issues.
Joyce, did you have a follow-up?
Well, I do. Well, yes, it is a zone, but you just said if someone decides to build there, they can. So, and that, yes, they will have to go through all those, addressing each issue. But at the same time, what if Red Robin comes and then you've put the zoning there also? I mean, it's an awful lot for people who have a nice, sweet street that's nice and quiet, and all of a sudden becomes a very congested, inhabited area. So, can you address that?
Well, I certainly appreciate that, and I don't disagree with you about the impact of the Red Robin 2 40B application on the traffic and the ambiance of county court. And I think that's one of the big issues that is coming up, as I understand it, with the ZBA meetings on that. The thing with the MBTA and 40B is that 40B, we don't have a lot, we as a town don't have a lot to say about denying a 40B application once the state has determined through their various requirements that the funding is there and so forth. So it becomes a negotiation with the developer, and that's what the ZBA is going through right now. Again,
No, I understand all that, but what I'm saying is, if that is being negotiated, and we're all working on trying to come up with something, whatever. But why would you try to add additional zoning there if this area is already being discussed? Why is nothing being done to the other areas? And also 109 is very congested. I mean, if you drive there during rush hour, it's pretty heavily trafficked.
Yeah, I think that if I might jump in, Joyce, thanks for the questions, and I think they're good ones. You know, I think this gets back to the conversations that we've been having about where an overlay district might go. And we are trying to get the feedback from the community to answer these kinds of questions. So yours are really good ones specific to county court. And one thing I would say, what Carol's been saying, it's a call to action to zone, not to build. To some extent, it's a matter of thinking also of it as an overlay district. So right now, county court exists. So if you imagine a developer coming in, it's not about putting more on top of county court. It would be reimagining a developer coming in and presumably buying properties, number TBD, and then wanting to rebuild in order to build a new type of multifamily housing where it already exists. So, you know, I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, there's sort of philosophical approaches to this. It's, do we think about a place where there's already development and therefore, by most estimates, would be less likely to be used for multifamily housing in this overlay district that we're talking about tonight? Or do we want to choose as a town a location where there might be a little more likelihood if there was water, if there was septic, because there's nothing existing already that a developer would presumably even consider taking down. So that's what we're trying to suss out with these surveys and getting feedback from the town, sort of what is the best course of action. And also, are there other locations that we're not thinking about? Because we still have time to be doing that. And that's the question that Jeff had alluded to. Are there other locations we should be thinking about? And so we're trying to really walk through all of these concerns very carefully, yours included, and to get to an answer that makes the most possible sense for the town. That's sort of what we're trying to do. We're not necessarily agreeing or disagreeing with you about your concerns, but really trying to draw attention to this idea that it's really not so much about requirement to build and how do we approach this so that there's an option, but is it more or less likely to happen?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm seeing a few more hands. Janice.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I live in county court and I understand Joyce's concern. I do want to say that apparently Aquarian sent a letter to the developer in December, and the Dover Board of Appeals, ZBA, was first notified of the letter just a few weeks ago that Aquarian can't commit to providing water to Red Robin 2, or what they're calling Tisdale LLC. So that's point number one. If you're considering zoning it for an overlay, again, Aquarian has already come and said, we're not guaranteeing any water to be provided whatsoever. My other point is County Court is about as far away from Needham to get to the commuter rail as possible. The traffic, obviously the traffic on 109 is congested, but so is the traffic going down Center Street. Going down Walpole into Center Street, I would hope or think that Dover would be considering a piece of property that is much closer to Needham than County Court. You know, I don't know where the other two properties are, but that's my concern.
Thank you for that. I want to point out that first of all, yes, it's quite a distance from Needham. We also have we abut Walpole, and what's the other stop, Carol, that we're not, that's not on my brain here.
Well, we also but Natick, which has
Natick.
MBTA. Yeah.
Exactly. So we have abutting towns in places other than Needham, but if the issue with access to the transportation has come up with actually all of the locations in our survey. The Junction Street properties by the high school complex, the middle school, high school complex, and the Dover Meadows property that was also in the survey is right in town behind, essentially behind St. Dunstan's Church. And the other properties that we looked at, but ultimately walked away from continuing to consider, were Dover Farms, also right in town by the cemetery, and Tisdale, right, Carol, the
Yeah.
fifth one. So you know, we're trying to keep that in mind, but you're right. You know, if the main consideration is access to the commuter rail, we have to think broadly. So
Yeah, and Natick again is just as far away from Needham. The County Court is just as far away to Natick commuter rail as it is to the Needham commuter rail.
Yeah.
So again, my point is, I understand why you're trying to pick an existing multi-unit community to do an overlay, you know, but is there property that you could be looking at, again, that's closer, much closer to Needham and Natick, that maybe isn't developed, to consider zoning that? Because if the point is to get people closer to the commuter rail, you're not doing it by picking County Court.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, that definitely location is an issue that as a town we can consider, but as a small adjacent town, the location itself is not a concern that we have to factor in. Some towns do have to factor it in. It has to be within a half a mile, but for us, we don't. So then it becomes, again, like, how does the town feel about the various locations that we've selected? Or if you have suggestions about property where we could run the compliance model, and this is sort of broadly for folks here on this Zoom, if you have suggestions about properties, we would really like to hear them. We have some you know, basic framework things that we know to be true. For example, we need about 5 acres for this to even be sort of a starting point discussion in terms of meeting the density requirements that the density considerations that we have at hand. But please, please reach out to the planning office if you have suggestions on pieces of property that you think we should be considering, because we're all ears and we would genuinely like to hear from you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Tara.
Great, thank you. Thank you for hosting this. These are really important conversations to have with the community. I wanted to build on a point that Joyce made, which is really a process question, because as she pointed out, you've already got Red Robin in that area making their way through the process. And as I don't know if she or Janice mentioned about the Aquarian flag, about not necessarily being able to support that. So my question is from a process perspective, knowing A, there is already a big development in that area, and B, that development has already gotten a red flag in terms of basic water availability. Why wouldn't that be a part of the assessment to say whether or not that should be available for zoning, knowing that there are already red flags for an existing?
Yeah, thank you. Hi, Tara. That's a great question. And again, this is sort of philosophical. I mean, there are towns around us who have identified one, for example, one town, Foxborough, has as part of their overlay district Patriot Place. So they're clearly not of the mindset that it's going to be developed for multifamily housing anytime too soon, but they're choosing it. So because we don't have to factor in water, we try to, Junction Street doesn't have water either, as we have come to understand through the experience that the town had talking with Pulte and their experiences with the town of Medfield. So availability of water is certainly something to consider, but it depends sort of, I guess, on how much you would like to actually see multifamily housing be built. And people have differing perspectives on that. And that's why we're trying to come up with, a variety of locations so that people have the opportunity to think through those issues. Because some could say, well, you could be cynical about it, or depending upon your perspective, you could say, well, I don't actually want multifamily housing to be built in Dover, so let's pick a location that would be very, very, very unlikely to be built on for the following reasons. Or other people might say, oh, I actually really want multifamily housing to be built, so let's make sure we find a location where it has the best chance of being appealing to a developer who would want to come in and build that kind of housing. So, we're trying to factor both of those perspectives in so that the town has the opportunity to evaluate these things, but also finding the properties isn't quite so easy. So we're trying to navigate all of those issues, but it's a really good point and question. Thank you.
Okay, seeing Justine.
Hi, first of all, let me just say how extraordinary your presentation has been. I have not been following this very closely. I think it's a terribly complex law, and I think Jody, you did a terrific job, and Jeff, Carol going through it. So I have a lot to think about, okay, but really extraordinary work. I think you've justified the existence of the planning board, basically, based on this presentation tonight. Okay, now having said that, I would say the following. Number two, it would be useful, I think, for the public to, when you identify these three spots, to also identify, if you are beginning to get into now, what the source of water is at the moment or not, and what kind of septic or not the three sites that you are discussing relate to. Okay, and you don't have to talk about that now. These are just observations. Number three is a question about funding. I'm sure many of these grants, 800,000 here, 900,000 there, et cetera, are very valuable. However, I would probably be interested also, and that you don't have to again answer this tonight, is whether there are other state funding to the schools, such as maybe special needs money, also the tarvia and patching, asphalt roads, et cetera, that may or may not be implicated in a negative way if the town of Dover does not pass this legislation. And again, you don't have to answer all this. Next comment, I did attend, as did other people, obviously, on this call, the ZBA meeting the other night on March 20th, where I guess I was sort of dumbstruck that the Red Robin people were continuing to be heard by the ZBA, even though Aquarian said they couldn't provide any water. And so it made me think, wait a minute. And the lawyer, by the way, representing Aquarian, the woman attorney, said something to the effect, well, that doesn't preclude your approving this project, which amazed me, is all I can say. And I'm wondering whether we get into some sort of legal, and I don't have an answer for any of this, whether we get into some sort of legal bind by perhaps approving the MBTA project, but then denying the 40B project. And I don't have an answer to any of this. But I just think water, the lack of infrastructure in our town seems to me absolutely critically important as a negative for a lot of this intense development, which brings me to my last point, which I heard on one of the NPR radio stations. I believe it was a senator, state senator, a Republican. I believe it was from Hanson. I could be wrong on that, who has some sort of bill before the legislature, essentially exempting towns that are not on the MWRA water and sewer. And I don't know where all that is. And I also don't know where all the unfunded mandate legislation is, or the Rentham legal case. And again, I'm not asking you to answer all this tonight, but those are the sorts of questions that I would have as a voter.
Yeah, those are all great points. Thank you, Justine. And we're not alone, because now all of the small adjacent towns are going through this process with the same compliance deadline, and all of the towns with infrastructure problems, similar to Dover, are having the same conversations. But I would say, we're, as Carol mentioned, with all of these issues outstanding, Rentham, all of these other issues, we continue to think our best course of action, and this is the advice we're getting from legal counsel, is to continue forward. And as these issues get resolved in court, or essentially, or through the legislative process, then we'll adapt as we need to or have to. But until that point, we have to kind of keep moving forward in order to make sure that we're doing the job that we're tasked with doing to get to compliance in order to protect that funding. So I appreciate your points. I've written them all down, and they're all great ones. Thank you, Justine.
Thank you.
Okay, Phyllis.
Yes, hi. I'm not Phyllis. I'm Ken, Phyllis's husband. But I have a question. Given that there is so much ranking around here, I think 32 municipalities have already rejected the MBTA Community Act, including our neighbor Needham, for whom we share the same state rep. Why are we voting on adoption in September when our compliance isn't required until December? Given that the situation is evolving, wouldn't it be more prudent to postpone until we get closer to the deadline to see how all these legal challenges play out? And I think this goes into what Jody was just saying, that, we're going to see how these things go, and we'll be evasive. Wouldn't that make more sense to delay it for as long as we can to see where we're at, instead of voting, maybe having to revote, or if the law changes, So
it's a really good question. I think the calculation that we're making with September 29th is to get as close to the deadline as we can. And if we don't get to a solution at town meeting, let's imagine a scenario where we have a September 29th town meeting and it doesn't pass, and now we're at risk of non-compliance. We have time then to go back to the drawing board and try to go again to town meeting. That's exactly what Needham has been doing. So we wanted to give ourselves a little bit of a buffer in advance of December 31st, recognizing that, it's pretty hard to keep the trains moving here around the holidays as you get close to the deadline. So we wanted to create enough space and time for ourselves, and to continue to see this evolve, but also not so much that we put ourselves in a bind. Carol, I see you nodding. You might have another perspective on that.
No, I think it's very, very well said. what we should also keep in mind is that there's various state law, as you can imagine, on the timing of town meetings and the notification that necessarily has to go out prior to a town meeting. So when we were putting together the calendar, we did in fact started at December 31st and worked back on notifications for a special town meeting and a second town meeting. And that's how we came up with the September 29th date. And in fact, we do have a date penciled in November if we have to go to Plan B. So an excellent point.
Okay, yeah, again, I just think where it's so fluid, maybe a vote won't even be necessary come September. I'm just trying to buy us as much time to make the right decision. Anyway,
Thank you.
thank you.
Any other raised hands, Chris, that you see?
Not seeing any. If anybody wants to get in a last minute question, feel free to raise your hand, but approaching the end of our time here. So really, really thoughtful questions from everybody here. We thank you for that.
And of course, sometimes it's hard to remember questions on the spot after you've thought of everything. So after the fact, please feel free to email any questions that you have to the planning department.
Yeah, we've dropped a couple things in the chat. You'll see we have the email where you can submit those questions or comments. We also have the MBTA Communities Act webpage, which is really serving as our primary source for really all the information related to this. So if you wanted to study up on your own, we have that. And then lastly, we hope that you heard about this meeting through a town communication channel, but I posted the link to our Stay Connected page, which has every channel that we push information out. So if you don't want to miss another meeting like this, make sure you're plugging into at least one of those channels on the site.
So if there are no more questions, thank you to Jody and Jeff for a superb presentation. Thank you to all of you who participated and to those that asked your questions. I think we've all taken notes. It's been very informative for us and has provided some more food for thought, and we certainly appreciate that. And keep those thoughts coming in, as Jasmine just mentioned. We do have the second information session, also by Zoom webinar, scheduled on April 23rd.
22nd.
22nd. So by that point, we'll have, as Jeff had mentioned before, we'll have more information and hopefully a lot more numbers on the survey. And we'll have addressed some of the questions and comments that we had tonight. So just because you tuned in tonight, I would hope that you would tune in as well in April. So again, thank you very much. And thank you to Jody and Jeff.
Thank you.
And good night.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great evening.